Over several centuries, countless East Africans were sold as slaves by Muslim Arabs to the Middle East and other places via the Sahara Desert and Indian Ocean. This is the Arab slave trade, the longest slave trade in human history. Spanning over a millennium, this trade network intertwined with the social, economic, and political dynamics of Africa, the Middle East, and beyond, leaving an indelible mark on the trajectory of societies and cultures. Originating long before the European transatlantic slave trade, the Arab slave trade predates the rise of Islam and stretches back to antiquity. Driven by various factors such as labor demands, economic incentives, and cultural norms, this slave trade occurred for more than 300 years, taking millions of Africans away from their continent to work in foreign lands in the most inhumane conditions. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which predominantly targeted Africans for labor in the Americas, the Arab-Muslim slave trade encompassed a broader geographical scope, encompassing East and West Africa, North Africa, the Indian Ocean region, and even parts of Europe. Initially, the Arab Muslims in Eastern and Central Europe took white slaves to sell them to Arabia, but the growing military power of Europe put an end to Islamic expansion, resulting in a shortage of slaves. Arab Muslims now look massively toward Africa. The Arab slave trade operated through multiple routes and modes of transportation, including overland caravans across the Sahara Desert, maritime routes across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and through intermediary networks that facilitated the exchange of goods and captives. Slaves were obtained through various means, including warfare, raids, and commerce, with captives often sold into servitude to fulfill labor demands in agriculture, domestic work, military service, and the thriving urban economies of the Middle East. Brought slaves by wealthy families were used as domestic servants and concubines. Arab masters sired children with the black female slaves. Black men and boys were castrated in brutal operations and made eunuchs. Those that survived committed suicide. The peak of the slave trade in East Africa really took off from the 17th century, as more and more merchants from Oman settled in Zanzibar. The island took on an even more important role in the international trade of goods due to the large trade at the Swahili coast, and consequently also in the slave trade. This is how the largest slave market in East Africa became a hub for the slave trade. In Zanzibar, enterprising Arab traders and intermediaries would congregate to purchase raw materials such as ivory and cloves. Subsequently, they would purchase black slaves, utilizing them to transport raw supplies and labor on their overseas estates. The Zanzibar market would be the source of slaves from as far away as Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. These slaves would then be transported via the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf or Arabic Peninsula, where they would be employed in Oman, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Due to Islamic legal beliefs, African Muslims were never taken as slaves. The Trans-Saharan caravan, on the other hand, focused on the West African region that crossed the Niger Valley and reached the Gulf of Guinea via Trans-Saharan highways, reaching the slave markets in the Maghreb and the Nile Basin. There were inhumane conditions on the journey, which may last up to 3 months, that saw the deaths of slaves from illnesses, starvation, and thirst. Roughly half of all slaves involved in this trade would perish during transportation. Arab traders were more interested in concubinage, snatching up women and girls who were forced into prostitution while living in harems, than European traders, who were looking for muscular young men to work in their fields. The demand was so great that traders would quadruple the cost of female slaves, who were captured with a 3-to-1 ratio of women to men. One of the distinguishing features of the Arab slave trade was its diverse composition of enslaved peoples. While Africans constituted a significant portion of the enslaved population, individuals from diverse ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds found themselves ensnared in the webs of slavery. Europeans, Central Asians, and individuals from the Indian subcontinent were also subjected to enslavement, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of the trade and the fluidity of identities within the regions affected by it. The impact of the Arab slave trade left enduring legacies. Muslim merchants conducting commerce gradually spread Islam along their trade network. Social interactions with Muslim merchants led many Africans to convert to Islam, and many merchants married local women and raised their children as Muslims. Many ruling elites in Western Africa also converted to Islam, and from 1200 to 1500 saw a significant conversion to Islam in Africa. In East Africa, the effects of slave raiding and captivity reverberated through communities, destabilizing political structures and disrupting social cohesion. Coastal regions became hotbeds of conflict and insecurity as rival groups vied for control over trade routes and sources of captive labor. In the Indian Ocean region, the Arab slave trade intersected with existing commercial networks and cultural exchanges, transforming coastal cities such as Zanzibar, Mombasa, and Muscat into bustling hubs of commerce and cultural exchange. The trade in enslaved peoples fueled the growth of urban economies, supported the expansion of mercantile networks, and enriched ruling elites who profited from the labor of captives. Yet, alongside its economic and cultural dimensions, the Arab slave trade also engendered profound human suffering and exploitation. The harsh conditions endured by enslaved individuals, coupled with the dehumanizing nature of their servitude, cast a dark shadow over the trade and its legacy. Enslaved people faced brutal treatment, forced labor, and the denial of basic rights and freedoms, perpetuating cycles of violence and oppression that persisted for generations. Even as Europe, one of the key players in the African slave trade, abolished the practice hundreds of years ago and the United States officially ended it in 1865, Arab countries continued the trade with the majority, ending it late in the 20th century. As we peer through the corridors of time over our cup of tea and coffee, the legacy of the Arab slave trade continues to echo in the cultural, social, and political landscapes of the affected regions. Have you ever heard of the Arab or Trans-Saharan slave trade? Drop "Yes, I have heard about it," or "No, this is all news to me" in the comments and say what aspect of this topic grabs your attention. Drop your thoughts below, and let's continue to dive deeper into the currents of history together. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more on A Cup of History.